It may be that the earliest religious or theological question that human beings ever asked concerned the fate of the dead. Prehistoric humans decorated the graves of their dead, left grave goods, including toys, with the bodies of young children. We don't know, of course, what they were thinking or what these grave goods and leaving them in the graves meant to them, but there's something haunting and moving about it. Graves would include the tools of the deceased, a bow for a hunter, a sword and shield for a warrior. And as humans became literate and began to tell stories and explain and leave accounts of their beliefs, we know that in many cultures it was thought that the beloved dead would go on a kind of journey, a quest even, and that they would face perils along the way. Graves began to include things that they would need for those journeys: food, gifts for the various deities and demons that they would meet along the way, and for the very wealthy, even modes of transportation. In Egypt, we learn that the Egyptian dead would face a time of judgment where scales would weigh their life and measure good deeds and bad to determine their fate. Today, this question of the fate of the dead is no less painful and perplexing. Even the most secular of persons will ponder what happened to someone they love when the light of life dims in their eyes. In the Bible, this question looms large, but it's not accurate to say that we get anywhere or anything like a complete answer to all the questions that we may have. To this day, the stewards of the biblical text, both Jewish and Christian, differ and sometimes conflict in this question of what happens to our dead, of what our traditions say about the fate of our beloved dead. When I taught at seminary, one of the courses I taught was called eschatology. And don't worry, I'm not going to reprise it this evening. Eschatology refers to last or ultimate things. Whatever some people think, it has very little to do with figuring out the future. I used to tell my students in that course that this was actually a course in pastoral care, because one of the most searing questions that they would ever be asked would be at the side of the bed of someone who had died. A grandchild may ask, "What will happen to Grandma now?" And whether or not you can answer the question, I would tell them, you need to be prepared to engage it. We heard 3 readings this evening dealing with the question of the fate of the dead from Isaiah, from Jesus, and from Paul. The first of these was from the great 8th century prophet Isaiah. In addition to being part of the Jewish and Christian canon, Isaiah is among humanity's most profound literary treasures. It was the basis of Jesus' ministry, I think, and perhaps even for his understanding of his own death. The verses we read today from Isaiah 25 are often and justly read at funerals. At one level, they describe Israel's God restoring his people and defeating their enemy and making them safe again. But it takes on a different note, a transcendent note, with verses 7 and 8. On this mountain he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. The context for this announcement is the promise of a great banquet, a feast of rich food and well-aged wines. And I suspect this is a background for Jesus' banquet parables and for the marriage supper of the Lamb in the book of Revelation. Both Jewish and Christian thinkers have long pondered the meaning of these striking lines. But whatever else Isaiah is thinking about death and life, he views this future as enfleshed, concrete, tactile, human. The epistle lesson is from Paul's profound reflection on the resurrection of the dead in 1 Corinthians 15. Now, there were plenty of disputes in Paul's time over the resurrection of the dead. Greek thinkers thought the idea was preposterous. We are told that when Paul preached on the resurrection of the dead in Athens, that they sneered at him, that they laughed at him. The very idea was to them absurd. And of course, back in the Holy Land, back in Jerusalem, the Sadducees and the Pharisees disagreed on the resurrection of the dead. The Pharisees approving of the idea and the Sadducees not. It's one of the few cases where Jesus and Paul appear to agree with the Pharisees. But here Paul clearly expects a new, restored, imperishable body. But even in this intricate and moving chapter, he struggles to explain what this might mean, as well he might. Every Sunday we stand and confess that we believe in the resurrection of the dead, but that doesn't mean that we are exactly clear on what that means or what it entails. Finally, we heard from Jesus in the Gospel of John. For John's Jesus, eternal life, or the life of the world to come, the age to come, as some would translate it, is not something that we will possess only in the future, but by dint of following him, something we possess right now. The Father gives life to the Son, and the Son gives life to those who follow him. And it appears that the dead are given the capacity to hear the voice of God and live. For Jesus and John, his followers, already possess life, life that will be rekindled and renewed in the age to come. As Jesus would tell Martha a few chapters later, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? What are we to make of this? In the 21st century, we may have as many difficulties with the idea of the resurrection of the dead as the Sadducees and the Greeks. Christians, it seems to me, have always been a bit more comfortable with the notion of the immortality of the soul than the resurrection of the body. Perhaps we're like the prophet Ezekiel, standing there at the edge of the proverbial valley of dry bones. God asked, mortal, can these bones live? And like Ezekiel, we answer, Sovereign Lord, you alone know. There are questions that cannot be satisfactorily answered. And when we lose someone dear to us, that is clearly not enough. But I think I can say this at least. Whatever the resurrection of the body or the immortality of the soul means, our faith makes it clear that our loved ones are not lost to us, but are held within the love and memory of God. Mark McIntosh was an Episcopal theologian and priest who died a couple of years ago. One of the last books he worked on was a book on mystical theology with the former presiding bishop, Frank Griswold. I'll let McIntosh tell his own story. I am living in the late stages of ALS. My body is now paralyzed, except blessedly for the ability to speak and swallow, though my speech is beginning to be impaired. Much of who I am seems to be falling away from me into silence. I have been immensely helped during this season by pondering the Christian belief that the deepest truth of who I am is not buried within me and subject to my own physical diminishment and death. Rather, my identity is sustained within God's everlasting knowing and loving of me, and of God's loving and knowing of us. There is no end. If we are each sustained within God's everlasting loving and knowing of us, we are sustained with and alongside all those we have loved and lost. They are alive to us because they are alive to God. And whatever those great banquets will entail with the finest of foods and wines, they mean that our humanity and our human community of love endures. We grieve, certainly. But as Paul would say, we do not grieve as those who have no hope. Thanks be to God.